Hello and welcome to the Intro to JavaScript. Today we're going to go over 6 items. We're going to go over operations, variables, if statements, for loops, while loops, and random numbers. And real quick, we're also going to go over how to access the console so that you can run JavaScript in your browser without having to download anything extra. Alright, so to start off, open up your Chrome browser, and then you can go up here to this little exclamation mark, and you'll scroll down. Now some people might have 3 bars, so it's either exclamation mark or 3 bars. It's so then what we need to do is we need to go down to more tools, go down to developer tools. Once we click on that, originally the elements should pop up, but what we want to do is we want to go to the console where we can execute our JavaScript. Alright, so now that we're in the console, we can actually expand this quite a bit because we don't actually need the web page. So what we are going to do is first go over operations. Now we're just going to go over some basic operations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and we'll kind of show you how it works. So to begin, we're going to do 5 plus 5. So you can just type it in this web browser, and you click in this console, and then you just click enter. And once you click enter, you see the results of that, which is 10, because 5 plus 5 is 10. If we do 5 minus 5, we'll get 0. Now, one thing to note is you don't have to put a space in between, but it's recommended. So we get 12. All right, so for division, you just do, we'll go ahead and do 12 divided by 6, which should give us 2. Yep. And then we can do 6 times 2, which gives us 12. So those are basic operations. One benefit we can do is we can also add strings. Now, up top we were doing numbers or integers. You can also add strings together. So if we want to add Java plus script, we get JavaScript. That's our output. Notice how there's no spaces in here because I haven't put any spaces in between these two strings. Alright, so now that we've covered addition, all of our operations, and please note there are more operations than just these 4. There's also modulus operation, which is fairly complicated. It kind of gives you the remainder when you're dividing. So for instance, if we do 12 modulus 6, there's no remainder, which gives us 0. If we do 13 modulus 6, we get 1. When we do 14 modulus 6, we get 2, and so on and so forth until we get 6, or until we get 0. There's 5, and then should be 0. So we've gotten 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 0 again. So that's what modulus is. Next, we're going to talk about variables. So variables are they're what we store our values in. Currently, we are just outputting the value to our output screen. But to define a variable, you type in var space, and we're going to define a sum variable, and we're going to set it equal to 0. And once we click enter, we get an undefined output, which means that the variable wasn't defined to begin with. So now we can just type in sum, and we get 0. If we want to set sum equal to 10, we can then output 10. Now the power of this is it allows us to store multiple values without having to re-enter them. So if we do, if we define a variable first name, and we'll set it equal to George, and we set a last name, and we set that equal to Washington. And please note, I am putting semicolons at the end. That tells the browser, or that tells the JavaScript that that line is over with. So when you're defining variables and pretty much doing anything, you have to use the semicolon. The reason we didn't use semicolons up top is they weren't needed. But you do need them for variables. Okay, so that now we can do first name plus last name. And please note the you cannot, we defined our first name with a lowercase f and a capital N. If we try and do a capital F, we get an error because that variable is not defined. So it takes the case that you're using to heart. So you need to make sure that you're spelling stuff right and using the correct case. Okay. So if we go back to our previous example right here, there's no space in between. The reason is because there's no space at the end of George and there's no space at the beginning of Washington. So in order to add a space, we're going to do first name plus, and we're going to add a space manually, and then we're going to do last name. And once we do that, we get George Washington, which is what we wanted. So now that we've talked about variables, we can then move on to if statements. Now, if statements can be complicated. They have conditions, or they're called operators. And let's go ahead and start it off. So to start an if statement, you have to it's recommended that you first define a variable. So let's make a new variable called name, and we're going to make it equal to this statement right here. Paste that in there. We're going to make it equal to first name plus last name. So now our name is George Washington. So let's do an if statement. Let's start an if statement. So to start an if statement off, you start off with if, and then you add a parenthesis. And we put our variable that we want to compare, and we choose the operator, which what we're going to use for this example is equals. So if name equals George Washington, so this condition, what it's doing is it's going to check to see, is this condition true? If it is, it's going to go into the first statement and execute that. So to define our first statement, we use a bracket, and inside this bracket is going to be our first statement. So we are going to do a console. This is a new something else we're learning. Console log, what that does is it outputs our value kind of like what we did up here. So we're going to do console log, and then we're going to say, hello, George Washington. And please note, at the end of all my strings, when I open up double quote, and I always close it, and same with the parentheses. And then I put a semicolon at the end. So this is not going to execute yet until I finish my if statement. So I've opened my bracket right here, and I've closed it right here. So if name equals George Washington, it's going to say hello George Washington. But if name does not equal George Washington, we want something else to happen. So for this one, we're going to put we're just going to put hello. And we're going to end the bracket. And then we're going to click enter. And then our code is going to execute. So what it did was it said, hello, George Washington. Now let's assume the name variable was not George Washington. Let's say it was Fred Washington. So we have now set the name to Fred Washington, and I'm going to click the up arrow to make things simple to get to my previous statement, my previous if statement, and I'm going to click enter. And as you can see, it says hello because name does no longer equals George Washington. So those are if statements. They're fairly powerful, and we were just doing a string. You can also do numbers. So if let's redefine our sum. Our sum equals 10. If sum, let's change the operator. Let's do a not equals to. So in order to do a not equals to, you do an exclamation mark and an equal sign. If sum does not equal 3, actually let's set it to not equal to 10. So if sum does not equal 10, then I'm going to say sum, I'm going to do a console dot log, and I'm going to set that to, and I'm going to output sum is not 10. Oh, I forgot to close that. So now I'm going to close my bracket, do my else condition, and then I'm going to do console dot log, and I'm going to say sum is 10. And then I'm going to close my last else statement, and then the if statement is going to run, and voila, sum is equal to 10. So what happened here is we check the condition, does sum equal 10? Well, does sum not equal 10? Well, sum equals 10, so it's going to skip this statement right here, and it's going to go down to this statement because if this statement's false, it'll go on to the next one. And you can do multiple if statements, but we're not going to go into that quite yet. So our next example is going to be for loops. Now, for loops are fairly complicated, but we can get through it. So, in order to do a for statement, you start off with the 3-letter word for, and you open your parentheses. And this is kind of going to be kind of like an if statement, but a little bit more complex. So what we're going to do in our for statement is first define a variable. We're going to define our variable count, and we're going to set it equal to 1. Okay? And then we're going to put a semicolon at the end. Now, for statements are broken up into 3 sections. The first section is the definition of the variable. That only gets executed once, the first time. Next, you have the comparison, which what we're going to do is we're going to check to see where count is less than or equal to 5. Okay, so currently count is, once this executes, count will be equal to 1. So count will always be less than 5. So this loop is going to run multiple times. It's going to run, it's never going to stop. So in order for us to get it to where it needs to stop, we then need to add a incrementer, or we need to add count plus plus, which means count's going to add 1 to itself. Okay, so we've defined our for statement, and again, we are defining first we're defining the variable count equal to 1. We're then doing a comparison, which the loop is going to check the comparison every time, and it's going to make sure, hey, is this statement true? If it is, I'm going to go into the loop. And then it does it increments count after the loop. So in order for us to test this, we're going to, again, put a bracket at the end, to signify that, hey, we're going to do something inside of this loop. So what we're going to do is we're going to do console.log, and we are going to output the counter is equal to, and then we're going to close the string, and then we're going to add the count to it. And what that is going to do is it's going to output this string with whatever our value for count is. So then we're going to close the bracket, then we're going to click enter, and it's going to run. So as you can see, the first run through, it didn't do the addition, but it did the comparison. Is count less than or equal to 5? It is, so it's going to go inside this loop. It's going to run this, and it spits out the first value, the first row. Then it goes back through it. It then adds 1 to the counter, and then does the comparison again. Is count less than or equal to 5? It is not. It is, so it's going to run and run until count's equal to 5. Then it's going to go back up here. Count's going to increment to 6. In that case, this condition will be false, so it'll break outside this loop and end. So that's an example of a for loop. Now let's do one more loop. This is the while loop. And we're going to redefine count. See, if we type in count, count's equal to 6 now. So we're going to set count equal to 0, and we're going to do a while statement. Now, for statements started with a for, so while statements will start with a while. And this one is a lot like an if statement, where we have our whatever we're running, a while in this case, and then our condition inside these parentheses. So we're going to do while count does not equal 3. And then, so this while loop is going to run as long as this condition is true. Once this condition is false, it's going to break out of this loop. So in this, we're going to do console.log count is, and I'm going to do lowercase count because that's the variable we defined. And then we're going to do a plus count. And then we're going to end our, nope, we don't want to end our for loop, because what's going to happen is this would run forever because we have not incremented count at all. So count will always be 0, therefore this loop will always run, causing us an infinite loop, which is something we don't want. So we're going to increment count by 1. And then we're going to put a bracket and end our loop. So as you can see, count was 0. We then went through here and we said, let's output count. Let's add 1 to count, and then go back up to this loop. So if you notice, when it was 0, it ran just fine. 1, it ran. 2, it ran. But once count was 2, it came down to this row, it added 1 to count. So count was incremented to 3, and then it went back up to this loop and checked this condition. Well, this condition is now false, so it's going to end this loop. All right, for the final section we're going to go over, which is the most powerful, I believe, or one of the most powerful, is random numbers. In order to do a random number, you have to type in math.random, and this is a function, so you have to have the 2 parentheses. So once we click enter, we get a random number. Now if I click up arrow a bunch of times, as you can see, these are all a bunch of random numbers. But these random numbers really don't do anything for us because they're huge numbers or extremely small numbers between 0 and 1. So in order for us to make these random numbers something we can use, we have to use math.floor function, and then we're going to do math.random inside of this function, and we are going to multiply this times 10, oops, times 10, and once we do that, we're going to click enter. So what this does, let's get a couple more values. What this will do is it'll give us a random number between 0 and 9. It will not give us 10. In order for us to get 10, we have to add 1 to this, and then it'll give us 1 through 10 instead of 0 through 10. So it will no longer give us 0, as you can see. Next, so that kind of gives us some values to play with. So in order for you to make this, let's say we want to make it 100, between 1 and 100, we just add a 0 there, and then we have 30, then we get between 1 and 100. There we go, there was a 99. So that's how you use random numbers. Now, the reason random numbers are so powerful is because you can combine them with loops and if statements. So let's go ahead and combine our random number with a loop, and let's do a while loop. And let's set sum, because that's the variable we're going to use. Var sum equals 0. Okay, so sum equals 0. Now let's go ahead and do a while statement. While sum does not equal 3. Let's put our bracket. Now inside of this loop, let's go ahead and do some, let's go ahead and output what sum equals so that we know sum is plus sum. And so that's going to output our sum value. And then let's go ahead and generate a random number for sum. Math.floor. And then we'll go ahead and do math.random. We're going to multiply it by 10. And we're just going to do from between 0 and 9. Okay, let's go ahead and end our while loop. And then there you go. As you can see, this loop ran about 4 times. So let's go ahead and set sum equal to 0 again. And let's run this loop again. As you can tell, it runs multiple times. This time it ran more times than this one. And that is because this number is being generated randomly. So you never know how many times you're going to get. And this is powerful for if you ever wanted to program video games. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me or your instructor. Thank you for your time.